Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. Few subjects have occupied as much space in American political discourse as Israel. Public support for Israel's existence has been high since its founding in 1948. But Israel's ongoing, often violent struggle with Palestinians over land, security, and human rights has left Americans divided over which side to support. Discussions of the conflict often turn toxic and personal and end in bitter recriminations and charges of racism and anti-Semitism. How did we get here? And what hope is there for closing the gulf between Americans and between Jews and Palestinians? Eric Alterman, Distinguished Professor of English at Brooklyn College, addresses these issues in his new book, We Are Not One, A History of America's Fight Over Israel. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It's been said that one should never write a nonfiction book unless one absolutely has to. Why did you write this book?
Oh, I absolutely had to. I actually began this book, I would say 40 years ago when I wrote my college honors thesis. And I even saved my notes. That's what a nerd I am. I still have the little index cards that I was writing on. When I wrote part of the book, that part I was writing about was the 1967 war. And then 10 years later, when I was getting my doctorate in history at Stanford, I thought I was going to write about this subject again, and I spent a year researching it. I tell people that when you get a doctorate, the thing that your dissertation is supposed to do is show that you know absolutely everything that's ever been written about the topic. And with Jews, you can't do that. They write too much.
It takes 40 years.
Right, so I gave up on that and wrote a different dissertation. That was my book, When Presidents Lie. But I've always had this book in my head, and I've written a lot of columns on it. You know, I was a columnist for The Nation for 25 years and other places, and I've written about it in many places. And finally, the time came when I needed to get it out. Now, if I hadn't done any of that, I could still answer your question this way, which is that there's two things about this debate over Israel in the United States. One is the subject itself is very complicated. Number two is people can't talk about it because they get too mad at each other. It's not an issue like global warming or inflation. It's an issue of people's actual identity. And so they don't listen to each other, they just fight.
Right.
So I needed 512 pages, including notes, to explain both the complications and give everything its fullness. At least I tried to.
American support for the creation of Israel began in earnest after the atrocities of the Holocaust were fully revealed at the end of World War II. But you write that even then, while American Jews contributed funds to the new country, few actually visited Israel, chose to move there in significant numbers, or involved themselves in the political affairs of the state. But that changed in 1967.
Yeah. Well, just to clarify, we're talking about two different things. The first part of your question, what a lot of people don't know is that for a long time, American Jews were anti-Zionist, or at the very least non-Zionist. They were afraid that to support a creation of a state for Jews would lead American Christians to question their patriotism. And it wasn't until Louis Brandeis became head of the Zionist Organization of America in the 1920s, where he said, no, Zionism, some Jews elsewhere need Zionism because they're threatened, but in America everything's cool, we don't need it. So that's why I call the first chapter Zionism for thee, but not for me. So once American Jews decided that they could support the creation of a state of Israel, but they themselves would not go, they became much more pro-Zionist. And of course the Holocaust, you're absolutely right. They felt terrible that they couldn't do anything to save European Jews, and this became the cause to which they could dedicate themselves. And the support for the creation of the State of Israel among American Jews was fantastic. It was the greatest lobbying campaign in all history, I would say, as far as I can tell. But then you're right again. After the state was created, they went back to their lives, and they didn't pay much attention to it. They maybe once a year marched in a parade. I think I collected money to raise trees on Halloween instead of for UNICEF. I raised it for the Jewish National Fund. But in 1967, when they feared a second Holocaust, when they feared that Israel might be wiped out, They were wrong to fear that, but they definitely did fear it. The whole thing transformed again, so that after 1967, and you can see it almost overnight in the budgets of American Jewish organizations, Israel became the single most important thing about being Jewish in America.
But what was it about the Six-Day War in '67?
Well, the Six-Day War was, what happened is that there was this pan-Arabism movement led by Egypt and also Syria, Egypt and Syria combined, and led by General Nasser of Egypt. And he shut down the Suez Canal, which isolated Israel from its trade operations. Also, it was very inconvenient for other countries. And Israel felt like they were about to be attacked. And Jordan, also on Israel's border, joined in the attack. So rather than wait for the attack, Israel attacked Egypt and wiped out its entire air force overnight and won the war, destroyed their Egyptian forces in 6 days, which coincidentally is how long it took God to create the universe. And many, many Jews, even not religious Jews, felt like God had re-intervened in history to save the Jews at this point.
And you write that this huge victory by the Israelis over these Arab countries made Jews, gave them a different concept of their own identity as Jews.
Before there was a state of Israel, unless you were an Orthodox Jew, which in America is only about 10% of American Jews, it was kind of hard to explain what it meant to be Jewish, aside from the fact that you had slightly different rituals than Christians. Nobody really argues theology in America, like was Jesus virgin birth? That's not important. So to be a Jew basically meant to be a liberal in most places. If you looked at the reform or the conservative annual reports, they would look a lot like the ACLU did, or Americans for Democratic Action. And so it's hard to explain what was going to sustain American Jews in the future. And Israel changed all that. It became another thing that American Jews didn't talk about much was the Holocaust before 1967. But after '67, support for Israel and the recollection of the Holocaust, I would say almost sacralization of the Holocaust, became the building blocks of American Jewish identity. And it stayed that way for quite a long time, even though these things receded, obviously, in history.
You say that, well, I guess support for Israel was the paramount issue for American Jews.
It was really the only issue.
The only issue.
Jewish education fell by the wayside. Jewish social services fell by the wayside. They were still, I give you an example. In 1966, the American Jewish Committee, in their annual report, did not mention Israel until page 35. And then after '67, their budget was totally transformed to support for Israel. So still the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, it cares somewhat about defamation and bias, but basically it's an organization that supports Israel. And for the longest time, the vision of Israel that was presented by the Israelis and by their supporters in the United States was a fantasy. It was like a Disneyland version of Israel. It was consistent, much more consistent with the movie Exodus than it was with reality.
And what was that vision? What was the Disneyland vision?
A very important part of the vision was that all the Arabs that left in 1948 left voluntarily, that they were told to leave by their leaders and that they would come back in 15 minutes after the Jews were defeated, and the Jews, the Israelis, had begged them to stay and want to live in peace. And that's completely false. We now know that the word Nakba, which translates into Arabic as catastrophe, and is the term that Palestinians and their supporters use for the 48 war, which the Israelis call the War of Independence, that really happened. And that the approximately three-quarters of a million Palestinians who left Israel in '48, most of them did not leave voluntarily. They were forced out, and then Israel expropriated their property with a law in 1950. So you never heard about any of that. In fact, Israel and its supporters made up this fiction that there were these radio broadcasts telling the Palestinians to leave right away. There were no radio broadcasts. No one's ever seen any evidence of that. A second fiction is that Israel treated the remaining Palestinians, about 150,000 of them, equally as they did to the Jews. That's also completely false. Up until 1966, the Palestinians lived under martial law. They couldn't go from one village to another without the permission of the army. They couldn't visit their families and so forth. And Israel really was not interested, was doing everything they could to encourage those, what we now call Palestinian Israelis, to leave. That's two examples. I could give you more.
So this idealized version of, you call it the dream of Israel, really wasn't, the facts belied that. I mean, one thing that made non-Jewish Americans support Israel was this idea that it was this bastion of democracy in a place where it was surrounded by dictators. Is Israel a democracy?
Well, one of the Arab representatives in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, recently said, Israel is a democracy if you're Jewish, and it's Jewish if you're Palestinian. So, yes, it's an incredibly vibrant democracy among Jews. At least it has been in the past. It's becoming less so in recent years. It's becoming more of an illiberal democracy like Hungary or Turkey or countries like that. And the United States, actually, in some ways. But for the Palestinians who remain in Israel, and certainly the Palestinians living under occupation on the West Bank, it is absolutely not. And we've now reached a point, which people never could have imagined back then, where if you include the Palestinians and the West Bank as part of Israel, which a lot of Israelis, most Israelis apparently do, and so do a lot of American supporters of Israel, there are actually more Palestinians than there are Jews living between the river and the sea, so to speak. So, depending on your definition is whether or not Israel's democracy. But for the longest time, one said Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East, and we share its values. And that statement was always a little complicated. It always required a lot of caveats, but it's harder and harder to defend today than ever.
Congress and virtually every U.S. president since Israel's founding have seemed to be unwavering supporters of the Israeli government, often going against the wishes of the State Department, the Palestinians, the Arab world, and most of the members of the United Nations. Why?
Why? Well, first of all, I'd leave the Palestinians out of that equation because Palestinians have no power at all in the American political system. They have a few representatives to support them, like maybe 4 or 5 out of 538. They don't have much organization. They're basically only influential in universities and on the left, like The Nation magazine and other left-wing publications. Maybe Democratic Socialist America, but they basically are powerless in American politics. It's true that the State Department and for a long time the Defense Department and the whole national security apparatus was much more sympathetic to the Arabs than they were to the Jews. They didn't want President Truman to recognize Israel as he did 11 minutes after it was declared. AIPAC used to just lobby in Congress quietly to get Congress to give Israel things it wanted. But when they lost a big fight with President Reagan over these AWAC planes that had really advanced radar, they didn't want the United States to sell to Saudi Arabia. They vastly expanded their membership and their ambitions. And what they did was they started attacking journalists who didn't write articles that were consistent with this fantasy version of Israel. They started peopling all the different government agencies with people sympathetic to their views. They started making sure that congressional staffs that were hired were sympathetic to them. They occasionally helped to defeat congressmen who didn't toe their line. And they became the most powerful foreign policy lobby in America, maybe in American history. The China lobby was pretty powerful too. There were others, but I think it's kind of like, I compare it to the National Rifle Race, the NRA. So it's actually, I think, a pretty good, they don't like this comparison. They would dispute it, but it's a pretty good comparison in the following way. 92% of Americans support stricter gun control, but we don't get it. Why? Because the people who don't want gun control are much more dedicated and much better organized and much better funded than the people who want it. So it doesn't matter what the 92% of people, even though it's fair to say that in America, people are more sympathetic to guns than in any other country. Now, same thing's true of Israel. Americans are more sympathetic to Israel than any other country is. As you said, the UN is it's always America and Israel against everybody. But they're not as supportive of Israel as the US government is. And that's because of the power of AIPAC and its allies that are so strong in keeping Congress and the rest of the bureaucracy in line. That's beginning to change a little bit. It's changing inside the Jewish community, where there's now organizations like J Street that are fighting AIPAC, but AIPAC is still incredibly strong.
So it's because of this huge lobbying operation, is very well organized, accounts for the huge amount of financial aid the U.S. gives to Israel, legislation favorable to Israel?
Well, you know, it's very hard to talk about this. That's one reason I wrote the book, because if you don't say it real carefully and quite specifically, it starts to sound anti-Semitic. Just, we're talking on a day when Ilhan Omar was kicked out of her committee, and her critics always pointing to this one statement she made that it was all about the Benjamins, which she apologized for, and didn't understand its implications. It's not all about the Benjamins. And by the way, that she was quoting some hip hop song. But the money is certainly very important. And so is the power. It's more than just money. And so is the support that's been gained all through the bureaucracy. But also, so are the feelings of people who support Israel, which is generally the feeling of many Americans. What I'm saying is those feelings, the positive feelings that Americans have towards Israel, particularly the Christian right, do not account for how much favoritism Israel gets. Barack Obama, who these people think was anti-Israel, he signed a memo of understanding giving Israel $38 billion over the next 10 years. It's the law of the land. There's nothing like it, not only in American history, in anybody's history. What other country has agreed to give another country that kind of money over a 10-year period? And now, you'd have to change the law. And then, I'm sorry to keep going on, but this is a good example of how powerful the support for Israel is. 2021, Israel went to war with Hamas in Gaza, right? And they have this weapons system called the Iron Dome, which they developed with the United States, which are missiles that shoot down other missiles. So Israel used up about $1 billion worth of these missiles. So Congress, even though Israel was getting $38 billion, Congress voted to give Israel another $1 billion to make up for this $1 billion that they spent. So the vote on that in Congress, only 8 people opposed it, and one person, AOC, didn't vote, abstained. So even though a lot of people are saying, well, Democrats are turning against Israel, and Israel's not so popular anymore, and young people don't like Israel, the vote was still 538 to 8, plus 1. So that shows you how strong the pro-Israel sentiment is and how strong these organizations are.
There have been a number of presidents who have been able to broker accords between Israelis and various Palestinians, but they don't seem to work. They don't seem to be, are they ever carried out?
The only accord really was the Oslo Accords that were originally brokered by Norway. It wasn't brokered by the United States. The United States jumped on and supported it. I was actually on the lawn that day in the White House. It was very moving and exciting to me. But neither side was really ready to do what was necessary to make peace, it turned out, unfortunately. The Israelis were not willing to give up what they would have needed to give up, and the Palestinians were not really willing to admit that they had been defeated, and they had to act like a defeated power and accept whatever deal they could. The way we've been speaking so far, you've heard me speak very critically of the Israelis, but I'm also quite critical of the Palestinians in this book. It's one reason I don't think anybody will agree with everything in the book. But the Palestinians, from the very beginning of Jewish immigration to Palestine have never been realistic about what they could achieve and what they couldn't achieve. And they've always demanded far more than they're entitled to on a purely power calculation. They may think they're entitled to it from a position of justice. A lot of people may agree with that, but the Israelis certainly don't agree with that, and the Americans don't agree with that. And if the Americans and Israelis don't agree, they're not going to get it because they're not powerful enough to demand it. So the Palestinians have never really accepted the reality of their position. I can give you good reasons for that. It's not entirely their fault, but it makes Israel's job a lot easier because they get to say, look, even if we wanted to make peace with these people, how could we? Look how unreasonable they are. And I have some sympathy for that position, even though I think a lot of it's Israel's fault.
One of the biggest issues is, as you mentioned, is Israel's continuation to building the settlements in the West Bank. Has any American president ever severely criticized them for that?
They've been criticized a lot. Only recently has the United States, President Trump was the first president to say maybe they're okay. And I just saw the other day.
Say maybe they're okay.
Maybe the settlements are okay. And I just saw the other day that the State Department representative at the UN refused to call the West Bank occupied territory. The Israelis prefer the word disputed territory. But I'll tell you a quick story that speaks to the issue that you're asking about. At the very beginning of Barack Obama's president, his deputy national security advisor went to see went to see a congressman to get his support because Obama was demanding a settlement freeze from the Israelis in order to restart negotiations. And he came back and he was all upset, and President Obama said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "He won't support us." And Obama said, "But wait, I thought he's against the settlements." And Deputy National Security Advisor said, "Yeah, but he's more against doing anything about the settlements." So that's basically been the position of all, that ended up being Obama's position. That's the position of all American presidents. They don't like the settlements, but more than that, they don't like doing anything about it.
You've written that there is a widening gap both between American Jews and between American Jews and Israeli Jews. What do you mean by that?
That's why the book is called We Are Not One. It has three different meanings. America and Israel are not one, obviously, although a lot of people think they should act like they are. Israeli Jews and American Jews are not one because they have very different views. And American Jews are not one because they also have very different views. So yeah, the shorthand for American Jews and Israeli Jews, is that Israel is a red country and American Jews are a blue country. Israel is the only democracy, we'll call it democracy for these purposes, in the world that prefers Trump to Biden or Obama. Every other country in the world doesn't. American Jews supported Obama and Biden by about 3-1. So there's a big difference there. And young people in both countries are moving in opposite directions. Young American Jews are more liberal than their parents and grandparents. Young Israeli Jews are more right-wing than their parents and grandparents. So that gulf is widening. And in the past, American Jews have basically deferred to Israel. They've said, okay, I'm a liberal, except if Israel wants something, I support that. That period is basically over. So now, particularly now that Israel has the most right-wing government in its history, we're about to see this split become larger and larger and more visible. And it's rough to predict the future. You don't know what's going to happen, but all the trends are such that American Jews are going to be less and less interested in Israel. And because the organized American Jewry is so tied up with support for Israel as its primary expression of identity, I think that American Jewry will become smaller and weaker as a result. That's one concern I have.
Explain that. I don't quite understand what you mean.
Okay, here's what I'm saying. For 50 years or so, the organized American Jewry has said, if you want to be Jewish in this country, you have to support Israel.
Right.
Okay,
Unquestionable.
Right. Young American Jews are saying, I don't support Israel. I don't like what it's doing. And I don't think that the Holocaust justifies what it's doing to the Palestinians. And I can't relate to this, the way the theocracy and the illiberalism and the harsh treatment of the Palestinians. And so they say, well, if what it means to be Jewish in America is to support Israel, and I don't support Israel, well, I guess I'm not that interested in being Jewish. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I wouldn't say this is the only reason. It's one of the most important reasons, though. The American Jews, the conservative movement and the reform movement have lost enormous numbers of people, particularly young people, in the past few years. The conservative movement has lost a third of its members. And the reform movement has lost about a fifth of its members, and that's because it's getting some conservatives, otherwise the number would be bad. And my argument is that this insistence that what it means to be a Jew is to remember the Holocaust and support Israel is not enough. It doesn't work anymore. It worked for me, actually. It's one reason I identified as Jewish for a long time until I got interested in Judaism itself, which didn't happen until my 30s. It worked for a lot of people in my generation and maybe a generation after, but it doesn't work for young people. It wouldn't work for my daughter, who's 24. She needs more.
It's a fascinating book, and with a lot of information about as you said, a very complicated issue. And I learned a lot from it, and I think that our viewers would too. And I want to thank you for Eric Alterman, Distinguished Professor of English at Brooklyn College, for joining me today. His book, We Are Not One, A History of America's Fight Over Israel, is published by Basic Books and is available in bookstores and online. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Twitter at 1-to-1 CUNY TV. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.